Good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting today in Canberra, the Ngunnawal people, and their elders, past, present and emerging. And thanks so much for joining us today at our webinar, where we want to explain a bit more or talk a little bit more plain English around the standard for unapproved vaporiser nicotine products. Happily for me, I'm joined today by Dr. Chris Shivens, who has an extensive experience in toxicology in particular, over almost a 20-year period working in regulatory science. I'm also joined by Leonora Tyers, who is a senior lawyer in our regulatory legal services branch, and who has an extraordinary ability to communicate, digest information and make it available to people in an easily understandable form, which I'm sure you'll appreciate as we move through the webinar today. So what are we doing here today? We have to be absolutely clear that this is about a proposed standard for unapproved vaporiser nicotine products. It's what the TGO, which we're proposing to be TGO110, is, and what it legally can and cannot do, what products will be covered, the proposed safety and requirement, quality requirements, and finally we'll also move into next steps. So we're not here really to rework any of the decision which was made late last year by the delegate for scheduling, that all vaporiser nicotine products will be prescription-only medicines. That's taken as a given. What we're working with here is trying to meet the delegate's recommendation that this kind of standard be put in place for the purposes of primarily assisting individuals, both doctors and users, to understand what it is that they will be the users will actually be inhaling. So it's clear that a doctor's prescription will be needed to access vaporiser nicotine products for any use at all. There are no therapeutic goods administration approved vaporiser nicotine products currently registered on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods at this time. So the means by which consumers can access these unapproved medicines are through the 4 traditional pathways: either authorised prescriber or special access scheme, which requires a doctor's application to the Therapeutic Goods Administration for authorisation or approval, or by the individual doing this via the personal importation scheme. In that case, the doctor does not need, in giving the prescription to the individual, to themselves, in a sense, or arrange for the access. That can be arranged by the individual, and the doctor can just be the Joe Ordinary doctor that is practising as a GP or otherwise in Australia. The other unapproved medicine pathways available are clinical trial related pathways, which for present purposes are possibly not so relevant to those who might be dialing in today. Just in actually having this conversation then, I think it's really important to bear in mind that what we're approaching the conversation with is the framework which we've been given. That's the framework that the delegate has given us. And that framework is basically that the vaporiser nicotine is not a consumer product. It is a medicine from 1 October 2021. And so whereas in other jurisdictions there might be certain requirements, because those requirements are in place to address what the delegate has addressed with the prescription model, there's no proposal that those requirements are necessarily, at the moment anyway, subject to your views, are embedded in this model, because It may mean, for example, that any measures to reduce attractiveness to youth, which the delegate has addressed with making it a prescription model, would be overly restrictive. That's things about flavours, etc. It may also be that, this is the thinking anyway, that issues associated with nicotine concentration or volume are also possibly potentially not necessary and might reduce the flexibility that a doctor will have in prescribing. So that's really important to bear in mind as we move through the seminar today. So it's also important to be really clear about what the standard can and cannot do. It can specify labelling, packaging and ingredients. It can't do anything about dosage regimes, vaporiser products that actually don't contain nicotine, and vaping devices themselves that are intended to be used exclusively to vaporise and administer non-medicines, that's non-nicotine containing flavourings, and that are intended to be used to vaporise and administer medicines and non-medicines. So the Therapeutic Goods Administration and this order have exclusive remit over vaping devices that are intended to be used exclusively to vaporise and administer a medicine. So that's really the nuts and bolts of the framework within which we're operating and the lens that we've applied over considering what would be appropriate introductory requirements for including in the standard itself. To take you further through that, I'll hand over to Leonora.
Thanks, Jenny. So in terms of the products that are proposed to be covered by the standard, as Jenny said, the standard is focusing on vaporiser nicotine products. So those are products that contain nicotine that are intended to be used in a vaping device. And we're proposing that the standard just focuses on products that have not been evaluated by the TGA and are not registered in the ARTG. That would include products that are accessed via the APS and SAS-B, SAS-A not being relevant in the context of these products. But I will speak a little bit further about where the personal importation scheme is used, and that does have an impact on people who are using the personal importation scheme with APS and SAS-B. There is it's slightly different for those products. We're proposing that clinical trial products will be covered by the standard, but we appreciate that some of the proposed requirements may not always be appropriate if there was a clinical trial of vaporiser nicotine, such as labelling requirements may be difficult if there was blinding in a trial. There is an option under the Act for consent to be sought for non-compliance from the TGA, and at the moment that's how we would propose to deal with any issues that come up. Extemporaneously compounded products we're also proposing covered. The products that would not be covered, as I was saying, are products that have been evaluated by the TGA and are registered in the ARTG. Those products would probably be expected to meet higher safety and quality requirements in order to pass the TGA's evaluation, and there are also other standards that would be applicable to those goods, including TGO110 in the context of child-resistant closures. We're proposing that export-only products won't be covered, just recognising that other jurisdictions do have quite different requirements to what we're looking at. Other products that contain nicotine that are not for vaping would also not be covered. So that includes nicotine replacement therapies or your traditional tobacco products. The therapeutic goods regulations provide some exemptions from ARTG registration for people who bring medicines with them into the country while they're travelling here. And that includes some sporting groups and kind of visiting government groups. We're proposing that those would also be excluded from the standard. And importantly, the standard is not intended to apply to vaporiser nicotine that's to be used as an ingredient in manufacture or compounding. It's just for products that are in final form for supply to the end user. So in terms of what this would mean for products from overseas, the personal importation scheme, which Jenny mentioned, involves a patient or their family member placing an order directly with an overseas supplier and importing a product themselves that way. A prescription is still required, and those products would still be subject to the proposed standard. However, the TGO can't take action against overseas suppliers of those products. So the onus is really going to be on the patient, probably with the assistance of their prescriber, to work out whether a product that they're selecting from an overseas supplier meets the requirements of the standards. Those products might still be intercepted at the border and potentially tested, and if they're non-compliant, possibly seized. So it is important to still check that your product will meet the proposed requirements. Overseas manufacturers of unapproved medicines are not subject to GMP requirements under our framework. So people who are looking to commercially supply products in Australia that have been manufactured partially or fully overseas really need to do their due diligence on manufacturers, and that may include obtaining a certificate of analysis for ingredients and for the finished product. And just to give a sense of how the proposed requirements that we're looking at would affect products that are sold as consumer goods in other jurisdictions. At the moment, we're proposing for the US products that have been approved by the FDA under what they call their PMTA pathway. We're proposing that those would be deemed to comply with the standard. That's because those products are assessed by the FDA as being appropriate in the protection of public health. They are still consumer goods, and under our regime would still be unapproved. But given that level of scrutiny by the FDA, which does involve an evaluation of scientific evidence, we would be deeming those to comply with our standard. It should be noted that there are no products that actually currently have that approval in the US, but we expect that could happen in the future. Products that meet the consumer goods requirements in the UK and Canada would comply with the requirements that we're proposing. EU products are likely to comply. The only issue might be if the labelling doesn't include an English translation. New Zealand is currently consulting on proposed regulations for consumer goods there. If those proposed regulations are adopted, then consumer goods in New Zealand that complied with those regulations would also meet the proposed requirements that we've put forward. So in terms of what those proposed requirements look like, first thing that we've considered was labelling around ingredients. The main benefit here would be transparency for prescribers and patients as to what's in products, which was something that was raised in the Senate inquiry to tobacco harm reduction. The question then really becomes how much detail is needed to meet that need, and there are a range of options from just having the active ingredient specified through to having every ingredient, including every component ingredient of flavours specified. At the moment, we're proposing a middle ground, which is having the active ingredient, all excipient ingredients, except for all of the component ingredients of flavours. So allowing flavours to simply be specified as flavours. That's consistent with Canada, the UK, EU, and what New Zealand is proposing. And it's also a matter of practicality in that component ingredients of flavours may make these lists incredibly lengthy and difficult to navigate. The next labelling requirement that we've considered is labelling around nicotine concentration and content. Again, we see this as important for making sure that people know what is in the product, and also in selecting an appropriate product. We are conscious that dose delivery of vaporiser nicotine is not solely dependent on the nicotine concentration of the product. How the user actually uses the product and what vaping device they use will also play a role here, but we still think that it's important to have an idea of the strength of the product. And then again, the question is, how detailed or prescriptive should those requirements be? We can see some possible benefits in having a very standard and quite prescriptive way of specifying nicotine concentration or content. It may make it easier to compare relative strengths of products, and we're also aware that sometimes the expressions of nicotine concentration or content on nicotine salt products can be a bit ambiguous as to whether they refer to the nicotine salt content or the free base equivalent content. However, at the moment, our proposal is to allow concentration or content to be specified in any manner on the basis that should at least give some ability to compare the relative strengths of products, while also encompassing that different jurisdictions will express concentration and content differently. So under the poison standard, vaporiser nicotine products will need to carry some warning statements, being keep out of reach of children, avoid contact with eyes and avoid contact with skin. Those are imposed through state and territory legislation. We have also looked at whether it might be appropriate to have additional advisory or warning statements, particularly pregnancy warnings and addictiveness warnings. Those are imposed in some other jurisdictions where vaporiser nicotine products are available as consumer goods, and often are intended to align with what is required on combustible tobacco products, recognising that they're sold in similar fashions in those countries. At the moment, we're not proposing those kind of additional advisory statements. Our thought process is that those are matters that doctors will discuss with their patients as part of the consultation, and whether it's appropriate to have those advisory statements on a product if they could in fact interfere with treatment. We're quite conscious of that, but interested to hear submissions. So under the changes that were made to the poison standard, all vaporiser nicotine products will need to have child-resistant closures from 1 October 2021. If our standard remains silent on what those requirements may be, then the default under the poison standard will be that all of those closures need to meet one specific Australian standard. That's actually more restrictive than what we require with approved prescription medicines. So approved prescription medicines can, under TGO95, use child-resistant packaging that complies with one of 5 international standards. What we're proposing to do in our standard is allow vaporiser nicotine products to also meet the requirements of TGO95, except that we're not proposing that they need to have directions for opening and closing. The other thing that we're proposing with child-resistant packaging is that for products that are packaged for supply in the US, UK, EU, Canada, and if child-resistant closures are introduced in New Zealand as well, is that those products could be brought into Australia in the packaging that meets the requirements in those jurisdictions. That's not to say that we would be allowing a choice for products from any jurisdiction to just say, oh, instead of TGO95, I'll comply with the Canadian requirements. That's not the purpose. It's just for products that are already packaged for supply in those jurisdictions, that they can be brought in without unnecessary repackaging if they already met the child-resistant closure requirements that are considered acceptable in those jurisdictions. The other packaging requirement that we have looked at is tamper-proof or tamper-evident packaging. This is required in the UK and the EU for consumer goods, and also it's been proposed in New Zealand. The reason that at the moment we're not proposing this is for prescription, as these will be prescription-only products, they should not be accessible to the public prior to supply. And therefore, the risk of tampering really should be picked up in the supply chain process. We actually don't require tamper-proof or evident packaging for other prescription medicines. We do have a voluntary code, which is some industry groups mandate their members comply with, but under our regime, it's not mandatory. So, you know, we would be probably encouraging people to look at that code and considering whether it was appropriate, but we're not at this stage proposing to mandate tamper or evident proof packaging. So I'll hand over to Chris to take over the major requirements.
Thanks, Leah and Nora. Chris Shivans here. I'm just talking about a few of the other aspects associated with the safety of the products containing these nicotine containing substances. And probably the key aspect, well, I think that often is discussed, is really the safety of the ingredients that are in these products itself. The objective of what we're trying to do here is not actually trying to develop a list of what is safe, but actually in the reverse, trying to prohibit certain ingredients that are definitely not permissible in these products itself. And using the overseas experience and their legislation to help to drive what's there, to help users, prescribers, and also the industry to fulfill that aspect from there. And a key issue is, of course, there's a lot of concern about these ingredients from there, but not much evidence about their safety in terms of inhalational exposure. We've got a lot of experience, more often in oral, you know, it's been consumed as a flavour or a food additive, but not necessarily as an inhalation. There's lots of research going on around the world, and including here in Australia, on the constituents associated with these vaporising products from here. What we're proposing here is probably a very narrow aspect, and that is that we'll prohibit the following ingredients in vaporiser nicotine products. That'll include active ingredients other than nicotine, and so that might include, for example, minerals and vitamins, but other ingredients known to have specific health risks. And we've actually identified 5 here at the moment that may appear on the TGO. This is ethylene glycol, diethylene glycol, 2 solvents or carriers, diacetyl or this 2,3-pentadiene, often used as a flavouring in e-cigarettes. They're the ones that give you that buttery flavour. And then, for example, vitamin E acetate that's been associated with serious lung issues reported overseas. And importantly, that aligns with what some of the work that's been coming out of the UK, Canada, and what's being proposed out in New Zealand from there. This doesn't mean that the list is complete, and it allows us into the future to add more to that as more evidence comes forth. There are a number of substances that might represent health concerns, and I recognise some of the work that's been done previously by our National Industrial Chemicals Notification Assessment Scheme, NICNAS, or as they're now known as ACAS. They did it in 2019, identifying quite a few substances that are of health concern, but associated are what risks can be managed as a result of those being present. We'd like to seek your input into how we should go about defining those. Our proposal is shown up above there, but maybe other aspects associated with ingredients, degradants, contaminants, heavy metals, you may actually consider are really significant ingredients that should be prohibited from these set of products that we're talking about here under TGO 110. Importantly, it doesn't mean that every other substance is safe to use. It just says we've identified these as high risk and should not be in these products from here. I'm just trying to move forward a little bit here, and I'll go, yes, if you wouldn't mind, thank you. There we are. One of the key aspects of e-cigarettes is the flavours, and that's what the appeal is essentially about for a lot of users as such from here. The TGA proposal is actually not to put any limits on flavours unless they're explicitly excluded, as per the last slide. And this aligns quite strongly with the UK and the EU. However, other options may be available. New Zealand, for example, is proposing only to allow certain flavours, for example, tobacco, mint, and menthol. Others, like Canada, for example, are only prohibiting certain flavours, like cannabis, soft drink, energy drink, dessert, or confectionery-based flavours from there. We've taken this basis from some of the information we received from the Senate Committee on Tobacco Harm Reduction in its final report that referred to some anecdotal evidence that smokers have greater success with certain flavours. And by restricting it, I think we would actually prohibit or frustrate actually prescribers in providing that optimal treatment regime for people who are trying to cease smoking, and by allowing that nicotine to combine with that one there. Importantly, these restrictions don't apply to flavoured vaporising products that don't have nicotine. So we're trying to maintain a balance between what's with nicotine, let alone what's outside of our remit, and that is in the other broader part of the industry. Of course, there are issues associated with health with some of these flavours, and we've already seen some of those associated with diacetyl, the pentadione from there. And it's that kind of information that would help to support changes and restrictions on specific flavours. We could, of course, look at all the flavours, and I do recognise a report coming out of Europe that identified in one study from the Netherlands of over 200 different flavour combinations. So you can understand it's quite a significant impulse to try and maintain a current list of what flavours should be or should not be allowed in these products as such. Flavours make it attractive for users, and we recognise that in certain circumstances, the youth of Australia may be tempted to use these products because of those flavours, but at the same time maintain, for those who want to use this as a draw process, a positive influence for losing that tobacco inhalation aspect. We're proposing that the concentration of nicotine in the container actually should not be controlled, but allow the prescribing physician the opportunity to use what is required for that individual patient, and allows for also that compounding in that pharmacy environment as required. Other options may be looking at aligning with the EU, UK, and Canada with a 20 milligrams per mil dose concentration, I should say, as opposed to maybe the Canadian one is at 66. New Zealand, on the other hand, is looking at a different way of doing that, and it's actually providing a maximum of 500 milligrams of nicotine per container. And interestingly, this is associated with the lethality of nicotine. Nicotine is toxic in itself. The lethal dose for adults, and this is where the science is a little bit diverse in terms of where is the actual number. Earlier studies probably tend to suggest about 30 to 60 milligrams for an adult is lethal. But other reports say up to about 500 milligrams may be lethal for adults. It's rare to see lethality in adults as a consumed oral or inhalational nicotine, but that's not to say it could not occur. So here we have a set of concentrations and thus limit on the concentration, and we'll talk very shortly about the volume of as well that might be presenting from there. So the TJ proposal is not to limit concentration of nicotine at this stage. Container volume, and you can understand almost with the previous comments, allows for whether or not it is safe to have that, that volume of nicotine-containing solution or product in the home, for example. In the UK, it's about 10 mils in the EU. However, other environments might allow for up to 1,000 millilitres. The New Zealand one, for example, doesn't actually define that volume, but a maximum of 500 milligrams for the container. Our proposal is not to limit that and allow for that to be aligned with the Canadian proposal. Overall, in terms of a little bit about the quality of the nicotine, it's proposed that apart from the pharmacopoeial standards that's already in force available within the organisation, nicotine is a scheduled product and is on the ARTG itself. Vaporising products covered by the TGA would be exempt from the pharmacopoeial standards per se. Although you may actually like to provide some feedback in terms of whether or not applicable monographs would be sufficient or supportive of the proposed aerosol e-cigarette formulation itself. Other monographs at the moment are mostly related to inhalational and nasal products, for example, and medicinal ones, and whether or not that they are proportional and appropriate for our use as nicotine products itself. So that's a few of the standards, a little bit, mostly about safety and a little bit about quality. So I'd like to pass that on to now to Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Today's slides will actually be published on the website. It's important, as Chris was emphasising there, to appreciate that we are looking for your feedback. It's clear in the paper and what's been presented today that all of what is put forward is a proposal. It's not a determined position. So it's important that we receive your submission. In making that submission, please do support your proposals with evidence or claims. And probably if you are in a position to do so, meeting the sorts of framework, overarching considerations that the lens that we've applied to the proposals that have been put forward in the consultation paper. Please make your submission by 31 March. After that, we will be furiously reviewing those public submissions. After today's webinar, we'll also be publishing, to the extent that we can, any common questions and our answers to them, and to the extent that that's not otherwise publicly available. It's proposed that the final TGO110 and its draft guidance will be published sometime in April or May, and that it will come into effect along with the scheduling decision on 1 October 2021. A lot of other work is going on in relation to the scheduling delegates decision, and we'll keep you appraised of that over the next 6 to 7 months. I think we might now turn to some of the questions that, thank you very much, you've given us the opportunity to consider before today, and do keep those questions coming in so that we can make sure that we're informing ourselves as well as you about what's involved in the proposed TGO.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to be reading out some of the questions for our panel members here. So the first question here is more about the scope of the proposed therapeutic goods order and about what products are covered, specifically concentrated nicotine liquid that is added to another e-liquid prior to vaporization. Leonora.
So this question is really going to come down to whether the product is intended for supply to the end user. So we are aware that there are some products that are intended to be mixed by the end user themselves. Those products would be covered by the proposed standard because that's more of a preparation of the product by the end user. So it's all about what the end user is doing. Is the product intended for the end user?
Next question that we have, I'm actually going to throw to Chris. So given that the evidence presented to the Senate committee was anecdotal regarding flavours, what is the TGA's approach here about including flavours, noting that we don't have much evidence for safety of inhalation?
Thanks for that. No, that's a very good question. But it's probably important to recognise that these are unapproved goods. They aren't going onto the ARTG, and as such, these products are already available in the community. The purpose of this TGO is to ensure that there is at least some minimum standards associated with the safety of these substances. And I recognise, for example, that the NHMRC at this moment is already considering some of updating their 2017 CEO's statement on e-cigarettes. That may actually give us a little bit more detail, more clarity about the safety of these flavouring substances.
That's great. Next question I actually have for Jenny. It's more about states and what states will nicotine prescriptions legally be available?
Thanks, Yola. As you say, this today is really about the product standard per se, less about, the prescribing laws that apply in each state and territory. To the best of my knowledge, and I will clarify this, because this is a prescription medicine, prescriptions will be able to be issued in relation to each state and territory, but we will make sure that we confirm that on the Q&A that we publish on our website. Thanks, Yola.
Thanks, Jenny. And the next question I have is for Leonora. What is involved to become an approved manufacturer here in Australia? How can a company apply for GMP certification if they have not previously worked in pharmacy product manufacture but are involved in the manufacture of e-liquids?
So thank you, Yola. The GMP process for manufacturers of vaporiser nicotine products is the standard GMP application process. There's a lot of information on the TGO's website, and perhaps in our Q&A on our website we'll include a link to that so that you can look at the resources that are available there. But there's no special application process for these products.
Thank you, Leonora. We also have a few questions here about the enforcement of the proposed standards. I might actually hand that over to Jenny. How will the requirements in TGO110 be enforced?
Thanks, Yola. Yes, because they're unapproved medicines, and this in effect will be primarily occurring via the importation route, we have been working with the Australian Border Force in relation to establishing arrangements for making priorities for detection, compliance and enforcement at the border. We have been doing that for the last month or so, and will continue to work with them up to the 1 October implementation date to ensure that we are appropriately ensuring compliance and enforcement with the obligations under the Therapeutic Goods Act. That does extend to the content of this, whether the goods do in fact comply with the standard. But as some quite careful thinkers have identified this week, the standard does not apply insofar as if contravention of it may prove to be inconsistent with the Therapeutic Goods Act in relation to labelling and packaging requirements. That basically therefore means that if you are bringing in an unapproved product, like all unapproved products, you need to be aware you are bringing in an unapproved product. It's not been assessed by the TGA for quality, safety and efficacy. That doesn't mean that there will be no compliance or enforcement in relation to the standard. It will apply in relation to the list of ingredients at least, something which is of particular concern, we know, to a number of you. So that's really what we'll be doing, and we'll be engaging with the Australian Border Force in the usual way in terms of any unapproved good for identifying priorities and our working relationship with them for ensuring compliance with the standard insofar as we can.
Thank you, Jenny. So the next question I have is for Leonora, and it's more about what communications, if any, are permitted by the manufacturers of compliant products to consumers.
So these are all prescription-only medicines, and so there are quite strict restrictions on what can be said to consumers about prescription-only medicines, and those will apply to these as they do to all other prescription medicines.
I should say on that too, Yola, that just so that we're absolutely clear, we will be publishing as we get closer to 1 October guidance material on what can and cannot be said in relation to advertising.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jenny and Leonora. I do have one final question from what I can see about clinical trials, a request for a bit more information about how this applies.
So the standard will apply to products that are intended to be supplied under the clinical trial exemption or application notification scheme. But as we were talking about, there is an ability for the TGA under the Act, under sections 14 and 14A of the Act, to grant consent to non-compliance. So at the moment, what we're proposing is that the standard applies, but to the extent that it wouldn't be appropriate for a clinical trial product to comply with it, an application could be made to the TGA for consent to non-compliance with either a specific requirement or the standard as a whole.
Thank you very much. I do believe that is all of the questions covered. Thank you. I'll hand over to Rachel.
Okay. Thank you, Yola. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Chris and Leonora. We hope you found that useful for you. I would like to also share some other useful links that have been provided. I sent these out through the chat function just moments ago, and our social media sites where you can also find some of our social media advertising. Our website is located there, which you'll find the presentation is located under the Events and Presentations tab, Newsroom tab, sorry. We are on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and blog, and LinkedIn and Instagram, so be sure to sign up where you feel. Thank you again for your time today, and you everyone on the panel. Thank you.